here to discuss, in a very nice segue, I think, from the last panel, private and personal in the age of a web of data, is Liz Brandt, who's the CEO of Control Shift, a company that very much tries to seek to understand the currents and dynamics and opportunities for personal data. Gavin Starks, the CEO of the Open Data Institute, and John Taysom, our very own director of the Web Science Trust, but also with an interest that he'll explain in privacy and at least anonymization technologies. So what I thought we'd do is perhaps take a little bit of a view from the panel as to their view on where we are. We're all generating tons of data. We've heard that. Lots of people seem to have a stake in it. The argument is, do we as individual citizens or customers quite have the stake in it we feel we might? Is there an asymmetry there? Want to be pursuing that? But also, what are the opportunities and challenges that face us in this kind of customization and consumerization of data, personal data at scale? Liz, could you say something a little bit, 3 or 4 minutes on what's the state of the market? Is there a market in this stuff? Is there a strong sense that it's evolving and changing?
So thanks very much for inviting me, Nigel. So is there a strong sense that it's changing? Yes, absolutely. We as Control Shift work with organisations to help to create value with the empowered consumer, and we see that the empowered consumer involved in the use of their data in one way, shape or form will be a great enabler for value in both directions, to the individual and to organisations. And organisations are significantly engaging in that now. I could say that over the last, so we've been going for 6 years now, and in the first 4 years of that, there was an awful lot of interest in what was going on. But now people are seeking to actually create value from that. And I mean, it's everywhere, isn't it? I mean, we're generating it in our cars, we're generating it in our phones. In the US, you can take a pill, it can embed itself in your stomach becomes the battery acid for it. It's lovely. It generates data which comes out of a little patch on your arm, it comes to your phone. Great for diabetics, actually, as it goes. Not very good for everybody else necessarily. We all get a bit scared about what's going on. And that is one of the problems, is that, this is very contextual and very personal. What might be good for one person might not be so good for another. And what's happening is large-scale use of data with some very blunt tools. What we're finding is that organisations who want to be trusted in this market are significantly aiming to be trusted and design services that can be trusted. And we help them design life management and decision support services, which we call personal information management services, that put the consumer at the centre. So all of our customers have come to the conclusion that actually if you put the consumer in control, then they will actually gauge what they will or won't share with you. And in fact, they will start to share it contextually with you. So you will say, I want to buy a new carpet for my house. You don't need to know how big my bedroom is until you need to know how big my bedroom is. And then once you've used that data, what's the point of having it? Because I'll share it with you again if you're trusted. So these sorts of services are being developed as we speak. And I think some of the big questions that are being asked in the previous session, businesses are grappling not with those big questions about surveillance, etc., but just with how does our society work, and how does law work, and how does my business work to leverage that data, enable me to be trusted over time. So, I think the other thing that's pretty obvious to me is that one of the constraints on this is consumers, and how consumers use and understand what's going on. And it feels very much like we're at the very beginning of the car industry. We've invented a car and we're not quite sure how to drive it, and people are ramming it into roads, not even roads, we didn't have roads yet, running into trees and goodness knows what. And at the same time, we don't know what rules and regulations there are. So it's very much we're making it up as we go along. But the thing that's very different about the car industry and this is that car industry developed over a long period of time, and this is just developing at a huge rate of knots. And how do we do that? How do we develop what consumers want and need and trust? How do you develop value with businesses, and how do you legislate and regulate that so that we all win, consumers and businesses.
I'm sure we'll come back to some of those themes in the course of the questions and the debate. John, you're very much in this personal data intensive world. You're concerned with the whole notion of how we might secure a degree of anonymity, or at least selective privacy. Do you want to say a little bit about where you see why this is a central, what you're trying to achieve with the kind of thinking you're doing around this?
Yes, sure. Well, thank you, Nigel, for inviting me, and it's great to see such a great turnout and some interesting questions from the last session. My interest in this was started really because I was invading your privacy. I invested in a lot of companies, and I was an entrepreneur starting companies which collected data about you and monetized it. And in 2007, I started a company which was making music free on the web, eventually acquired by Tesco. I had all the information about my son's behavioral data from the web, and I also had his mobile phone location. And I thought this is going to be a problem at some point in the future. So I filed a patent on a way to dissociate the data utility from the individual identity. And my interest since has really been in the digital civics, if you like. How do you wrap this strange new world that we have built for the next generation in some semblance of what we used to think of as a social contract? I thought it was interesting that they're using the word social compact rather than social contract. But this whole Magna Carta aspect that Sir Tim has been focusing on, my interest is, does it potentially have some algorithmic solution? Can we use the technology to solve a problem that the technology created?
Okay, thank you very much. And Gavin, you're sitting there helping direct the exploitation and utilization of open data. People often get confused about varieties of data. How do you see this data landscape evolving that has open in it and personal in it? What are we to be concerned about?
Sure. I think the starting point just in terms of data literacy is to understand that when we talk about open data, we're talking about licensing. And there's a data spectrum from closed to shared to open. And over the top of that, you can layer personal data, you can layer big data, which is very much a vendor-driven term, and you can have everything from national security at the secure end to a bus timetable at the open end. So let's be very clear about the delineations here. I think the broader picture from my perspective and the work we're doing at the Open Data Institute is really looking at data as infrastructure. And I say that as I have a very strong personal belief that the web is a social response to globalization. And when we look at the growth of the web of data, whether it's being used in personal, medical, healthcare, how are we going to find solutions for cancer? How are we going to find the next antibiotics? How are we going to address climate change? How are we going to invent carbon neutral engines? These are going to require vast investment from a vast number of people around the world. And so the ability for us to collaborate on those vast scale challenges requires vast scale connectivity. But it comes with it, as we've heard already earlier today, a whole set of questions. So when we talk about national data infrastructure and think about geospatial information or think about company identifiers, as we bring together the digital world and our physical worlds, I think one of the comments that was made earlier about we can apply the rules of our three-dimensional world in a digital world, I don't think is true because we're increasing the number of dimensions quite substantially. The challenge we've got is when we think about something like a company identifier, and yes, we've got Companies House in the UK, and then how is that infrastructure replicated in all countries around the world? And then think about that in terms of the URLs for every company on Earth and which entity should be overseeing those in a global data infrastructure. What's our sense of interaction with those? In some ways, you could think about the internet there as a different country, or maybe even a different planet, where we're bringing together the world's information, and that tends to ignore legislative boundaries. It tends to ignore the kind of social contracts that we've got maybe in a country-by-country basis. So I think I'm really interested, just on that social compact or I prefer social contract personally, is what is our social contract between us and our state on a national level and an international level, but also what's the contract we're creating between each other as citizens, and how do we respect our individual privacy if we're setting up a company in the UK, we may suddenly find ourselves working in a different country. And we're not creating and discussing those sort of social norms and how they bridge the different countries. So I think it's a really complex issue, but huge amounts of ability to innovate. At the ODI, we've trained over 1,500 people in the last couple of years. We've got over 300 members now, and we've reached over 1.2 million people worldwide just in our short sort of 2-year history. So we see huge momentum building here, but the questions we're getting asked are, one level, what is the difference between open, closed, and shared? What is the difference between big personal and company corporate data and state data? And it's a bit of a mess right now.
Okay, thank you. So, Liz, where are the because people, there are great principles at stake here, but where are the concrete examples of where personal exploitation of data is yielding significant insights, and when and how does that start to get creepy?
Well, it starts to get creepy when I know something about you that you don't know, and you find out that I know something about you that you don't know. That's that point at which
We can agree that's quite creepy.
we can't go, exactly. So there's a way of defining it actually quite easily. So a lot of people know lots of things about me that I don't know, I believe, but I'd rather that I didn't know. And if I do know, I'd like to ask them rather than them use it to try and sell me a new pair of trousers or something. So that's the creepy question, and it's one of the questions that absolutely every business we work with is trying to understand and manage away from, if you want to call it that, so into that creepy zone. And I mean, we ask where are the big benefits at the moment, and maybe it's heresy in this room to say, well, it's Facebook and Google who are making creating huge value out of personal information. And I think they are at the forefront of this whole debate, interestingly, of course, because they are using that data to create value for you and me, although I have to say I don't use Facebook. But they are using it to create value. But where is it going? Because they still haven't dealt with all the issues that are going on around us. And what we're seeing, of course, is a very interesting battle being set up, so battlegrounds being opened up between the likes of Microsoft, who launched a Don't Get Scroogled campaign, and Tim Cook from Apple coming out and saying, we are not going to exploit people's personal data, launching Apple Pay with a very transparent business model. So there's lots of value to be had, lots of value to being created already. I think the battleground would be around business models and how people will use different business models. We've identified 9 new business models in the use of personal information. Advertising is just one of them. So I think that's a long way around. But the thing that's obvious to me at the moment is that the ones that are being successful are currently founded on a business model of advertising, and it is almost the accidental business model of the internet. And there are so many others that can be used and on behalf of the individual and organisations.
So perhaps we'll come back to new business models. But John, I mean, this creepy factor, or I mean, in some sense, your Damascene experience as you realised just what you knew about your son's kind of whereabouts and musical taste. Can technology solve this for us, or is it a new social compact? Is it a new set of social norms that are required? Where do you see the balance? And can we trust companies?
Well, I think one of the things I realized fairly early on is that the thing that guides us typically and makes capitalism work, which is choice, on which I personally place a very high value, does not work well for privacy. And that's a bit of a eureka moment when you realize that actually there's a structural reason why privacy is not well placed within the normal structure of choice that we use to decide whether we should or shouldn't use a product. The reason for that's slightly technical, and it actually came out of the work on management decision-making under uncertainty. Academics were studying why was it that people took very short-term decisions often, they underinvested. And it was realized that when the benefit and the cost are separated in time, we are particularly bad at making decisions. So if you have big costs now and a benefit in the future, you tend to underinvest. If you have a benefit now but a cost in the future, you tend to overconsume. And so there's a structural reason why we overshare, or why the problem of oversharing occurs. Now, once you realize that you can't solve that problem by giving the user control. It'd be nice to think you could, even if there were the nuances of privacy and the use of the data that people could actually understand. And I hosted a seminar at Harvard where one of the people attending was had a background in medical records and was a well-known computer scientist. He said he couldn't figure out himself what the implications were of ticking the various selection boxes on the use of his own medical data. So how anyone else was supposed to, he really didn't know. So I think that's the first eureka moment, and the first thing one has to understand in trying to set some norms. The second thing I think is that my data alone, to my horror, isn't worth anything. I thought it was, but actually it's only worth something when I share it with yours. And it's the amalgam of the data and the data insights you can draw from that that actually turns out to be valuable. And we know this empirically because a number of startups have tried to take individuals out of the ecosystem and add them back incrementally as units of one, and they've all failed. Now, there may be a new one that comes along that suddenly is successful, but I think it's unlikely, and the reason I think it's unlikely is because an individual's data isn't worth much. Now, once you have that second eureka moment, or whatever, then the solution becomes somewhat easier, because if I can place people who are wearing blue linen jackets into a group in this room, and I think there are 4 of us or 5 of us I can see, I can then replace, in almost every transaction, I can replace the group, the cluster of blue linen jacket wearing men in 101 Euston Road for all intents and purposes, because the number of times you know it's me is really very few and far between. Of course, when you get to security, it's a different matter, but even there you can pre-screen without needing to the underlying identity. So that gives way to a whole bunch of new and very interesting business models. It also, and I'll just go on 1 minute if I may, it also unpicks a problem which has bothered me for a very long time. If you go and buy a book called Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty, fantastically explosive book, in the back and look down the index, you'll find the term information capital, which you thought might be in there because after all, information capital basically is what Google and Facebook and most of the other large concentrations of wealth in the last 15 years have in effect been exploiting, doesn't exist in the index. There's no reference. If you look at Google's balance sheet, you'll see it's got intellectual capital, capitalized code, it's got physical capital, some plant machinery, but the data about you, Nigel, isn't in their balance sheet, which is really odd because it's not inventory. They don't buy it and sell it, and it's not capital equipment. So it's not in the balance sheet. So this idea of information capital, I think, starts to be a very interesting notion. And I think, perhaps Liz is already having a look at some uses of generating and using information.
So some really quite deep issues bubbling up here already. I like this notion about the role of privacy in capital markets and whether it, why there is this tendency of people to give so much away. Because again, Martha Lane Fox recently has been arguing for this establishment of a public digital space in which there is, that we as consumers and citizens have many, in some sense, more rights or assumptions here, that we're not just giving it all away for the benefits you're deriving are immediate to you in this space, and you're not actually having to make this kind of difficult contract that John was talking about. What do you think this tensioning between open and private, what kind of solutions is that tending to lead us towards then? Yeah.
So I think it's, as I said earlier, it's quite messy, and the kind of options that we need to explore are at one end of a spectrum. The web that we know is largely privatized. So are we, in our combining of our digital and physical spaces, are we simply creating a private marketplace? However open that marketplace might be, what is the notion of civil society in that space? And should we be really discussing and creating the notion of a digital public space? I think so. There you could take a view right at the other end of the spectrum is that actually one direction of travel which seems to be evident right now is there will be no such thing as privacy. That I will be able to access, legally or not, information about just about anyone or anything, I wish, you know, and you can set your calendar or watch on that depending how quickly you think things are moving. And there's there's a fantastic book by an author called Sumyati, 1921, who wrote a book called We, which is all about completely transparent, as in there was no privacy society. It's a book that 1984 was based upon. Actually incredibly prescient to some of the patterns we're seeing today. And I think...
Pretty dystopian.
Pretty dystopian, but this is part of the social conversation I think we need to be having. And I certainly don't think at this point that we've got the level of data literacy in the country to really have an informed debate about these issues. You have data is evil as a kind of headline, whether it's Facebook using things or the NSA spying on us or some government leak somewhere. So data has a very bad connotation in the kind of public sphere, but actually we're kind of stumbling into just giving away more and more for exactly the reasons that have just been mentioned. So how do we have a conversation in the UK about this that is informed, that does explore some of the new potential social norms, the contract between state and citizen, social contract between companies and citizens, and the social contracts with each other. You know, in a town or a village, you know your neighbors. You have an awareness of their information, and you may gossip about that, but you don't necessarily think about, well, if I happen to tweet that particular bit of gossip, it gets indexed forever to some analytics company in China. So these discussions we're not really having, and very notably absent from any political debate around the election.
Okay, thank you. Look, we'll take a few more questions from the panelists, and then I'd like to open it up because I think there's probably a good appetite for questions from the floor. One of the premises around the My Data or personal information empowerment was that actually citizens are both interested and motivated to control their own information or personal information. That's one of the thoughts. And do we know if that's true?
I think the answer is it's not true.
It's not true.
In that people are not interested in their data, they're interested in what they can do with their data. And I think actually driving forward on something like My Data, it's about involving the individual in the use of their data and bringing them into the whole economy of information, which helps to bring up their education and understanding of the use of their data. When we've done research with consumers for our customers and independently, if you ask people, are you interested in your data, they're just so not interested in it. And I think something like Noddle, which is Core Credit, as a credit rating agency, has created something called Noddle. So your credit rating is available to you free of charge for life from Noddle. I think they got some appalling uptake, like 4% of people took it, and something like 4% of them looked at it more than once. I mean, who wants to look at it? Anybody here? I mean, once, maybe, just for intrigue. But actually, where's the great benefit? The great benefit is being able to use that data when you're going out to find your credit card. Because instead of being told you can have the pink, blue, green, yellow, silver one, gold one, everything, it just says, hey, your credit rating is rubbish. You can have the pink one or the yellow one, and everything else, stop. And how great is that? A, I'm not fed up. B, the business that's trying to get me to take a new credit card hasn't wasted loads of time.
So we don't care about it that much. The statistics of one, as one of my postdocs once famously said, is a very lonely place to be. You can't really make a difference on the market if you just take one person's data out. I mean, how do we mobilize, given Gavin's points, how do we get people to care? Why they will get into a moral panic about certain issues, surveillance, these other use of the NHS, offshoring data?
But the thing is, I mean, if you ask somebody who's interested in your data, no is the answer. But if you ask somebody, if you're asking them to help design, we'll help organisations design new services, and we bring consumers in to do that. And if you're asking consumers how they're feeling about this new service, where they're sharing, let's say, all their information about their health, at that point, they start to get concerned about the data. And it's not that they're specifically interested in it. They're just interested in what it can do for them. They are concerned about it, though. And how that data is being used on their behalf is where they're concerned. And so they will share it so that if, let's say it's a health service, they will share it so that somebody can help me with my asthma. But what they don't want is to see it onward shared and be out of control. So something about sharing, usage, but also control that the individual feels a need to have. And interestingly, more recently, we found that people are increasingly concerned about the investment of time they're making in sharing their data and whether the services will have a longitudinal capability and therefore worth spending time with.
They're going to be there for any length of time.
Which I think is a sort of backlash to apps, which I think is kind of sort of what I call apathy. You know, basically people have got so many of these damn things, you know, it's like, I can't be bothered anymore with them.
About infrastructures, who owns them and how long will they endure?
Yeah, definitely.
John, I mean, what should web science be doing about any of this? What's the role for an academic discipline on these sorts of topics?
Well, the great thing about web science is it deliberately draws from a number of different disciplines, and I think that's exactly what you have to do to solve this particular problem. I think certainly if my analysis is correct, it would be right to, I would certainly support a much more paternalistic regime where people were not able to share data that perhaps might at some future date be problematic for them. That probably is something I would like to see in law. I think it also probably begs the question about an institution that helps to police this. And maybe this is a role for Martha's new institute, is to take exactly this view, a somewhat more paternalistic view, to prevent people from oversharing. The second is, I think it needs to be very much more collaborative, because clearly people have a concern about their information assets. They have very little incentive to do much about it, because information assets, which you're born with, which you collect as you go through life, those information assets have no role as capital currently, which is really odd, because they are, as I say, the underlying driver behind this massive capital creation. So the third thing I think is that the web science can help to shine a light on the way in which technology can be used to provide economic drivers. Economists, Latin American economists, looking at how assets become capital, concluded that they become capital when you have laws and institutions which enable assets to become capital. This is Fernando de Soto. He was studying a completely different thing. But my conclusion is we need to be more paternalistic, probably, and that has all sorts of ethical issues, which is why I think some of the legal issues come into web science. It needs to be collaborative, and in particular, it needs to be driven by some kind of economic reason to want to take an interest in your data, and that I think comes from letting people have access to the information capital that their information assets are actually being used to derive.
And Gavin, response to that, I mean, what about the institutions that...
So I think lots of questions raised there. Let me indulge me with a couple of thought experiments. One is it's taken us hundreds of years to get to a point where we have a land registry, where we have the definition and the concept and framework around the existence of property rights in the physical world. And they're a foundational piece, which we quite often forget how long it took us to get there. In countries like Peru, for example, they're still kind of just working this out. But really, you can't base the rest of your economy with any great stability unless you sort out some of these foundational issues. And I see us at the same point. You know, we're 200 years to go almost into the definition of a global data infrastructure or national data infrastructures, where some of the patterns around even what are the categories of data that we should be thinking about. And I think, come back to again, an earlier comment about trying to reach some kind of Nash equilibrium here, is yes, there's a huge amount of drive towards a more paternalistic view, typically from the older generation. Has been my observation. The
clues in the word, isn't it?
Yeah. So this is not unexpected, right? So, but when we look at the potential scenarios here, and I think it's worthwhile looking at what the extremes could be to work out where some of the balance points could be within that. So at one end of the spectrum, I see an absolute absence of any privacy whatsoever. So we don't get the legal frameworks in place, we screw up on the technology, we let rampant sort of commercial interests just get all the data, and then it just accidentally gets leaked or hacked or whatever because there's some two-person startup who has data for 50 million people, and they just shut down and it gets auctioned off to a bit like Radio Shack did actually, auction off all their user data. So that's kind of one dystopian future. There's another dystopian future which is, again, very much mirrored, I think, in a lot of our physical world. How many people have been in an airport this year in the audience? Quite a lot of us. How many people would like to live in an airport? I'm not including Orkney here, right? So, but I think, when I look around us here in London and the kind of top-down technocratic, can we build the city to scale? It doesn't really include the voice of the user. And I think there's a massive, so we're kind of copying that top-down methodology in our digital space is extremely dangerous. And so part of the equilibrium here for me is to say, how do we reintroduce a sense of agency into our citizens, into our communities, into local cultures, not just in the design of cities and the design of their environment, but in the operation of those cities and environments? And I think there's a massive opportunity here to create a much better feedback loop, which includes that sense of agency in the design and operation of our environments. And we're missing that. I don't really hear that, again, in this conversation about, yeah, technology will save us, no, it won't. Legislation will save us, no, it won't. Governments will save us, no, they won't. Businesses will save us, no, they won't. It really has to be about everybody collaborating here. And that's why I really strongly believe we need more voices around this table. And your example of the take-up of how many people were interested in their credit reports, I'd be really interested to see how many people they reached in the lower socioeconomic groups, and what sense of agency was built into that product. And I'm pretty certain that it would be pretty low. So we might be just reaching the people who are digitally connected, the people who are university educated or have an understanding deeper understanding of what's going on.
Okay, great. Okay, look, we started late. It's past. We're going to carry on and open up the questions, I think, to the floor, if that's right. Questions from the floor. Any questions from the floor? Yes, back there. It's coming around. It's fine. Yep.
This may be a rather prosaic question. But we've heard
Let's just say, if you could just introduce yourself.
Sorry, I'm Dan Headley. I'm a tech lawyer. Yeah. Heard an awful lot about empowering people, introducing a sense of agency. A major prerequisite of that is presumably that people know what's happening with their data in the first place. And as an industry, that's a task which you have all delegated exclusively to us lawyers, which is a mistake because we're terrible at it. Well, I mean, obviously, if you get me to draft your privacy policy, it'll be a model of plain English clarity and brevity. But the fact is that most privacy policies are 15 pages long, impossibly vague, and nobody reads them anyway. To the extent that there's actually now a project called Terms of Service Didn't Read.
Your question is?
My question is this. How do you fix that?
Okay, excellent. Okay, so, yeah. We want to give everything to the lawyers to solve our problems? Yeah.
Well, you should definitely come on one of the Open Data Institute's training courses for lawyers. But I think that there's a real sense of urgency around reframing privacy statements to data usage statements and kind of reframing the language we use right from the outset. But I think, again, very few people read those, or even fewer people understand them, including quite often the organizations that are commissioning them. And I think the more important question is actually to start broadening the conversation around the use cases and saying, like, these are the consequences of you releasing your information about whether or not you've got diabetes or what your transport information is.
Just quickly then to take two of the views, so Liz and then
So
John.
yeah, so I think like with so many of these things, like we always think of terms and conditions and sharing as great big lumps. And they are, because we write a set of terms and conditions, and there it is, you tick the bottom box. Whereas there are services that are being developed right now that enable you to track what terms and conditions you're signing up to, and then highlight when those terms and conditions are changing on the fly to say whether or not they are actually relevant for what you're trying to achieve. So it enables you more agency again. It's giving you more. So it's disintegrating some of that lump of terms and conditions. So I'm not sure how we stop lawyers from writing Wugga-Humph-to-Mumph, but and I think actually being able to disintegrate some of that stuff and enable it to be used contextually is going to be one of the key factors of success.
I think lawyers are really good when you've got already got your concept sorted out at producing language which is absolutely watertight in a legal context. That's what they do really well. They're not so good if you haven't got the concept sorted out. You tend to get very prolix documents. In this particular case, the problem we have is that privacy is not a very well thought through concept. We use it in all sorts of rather contradictory ways. Now, we used to have this problem with other words. We had a problem with the word freedom for a long time. And it was only when Isaiah Berlin wrote his Two Aspects paper about, was it 1950s, that we really teased apart the idea of negative and positive freedom and the way in which my rights impinge on yours and how we should resolve that. Now, we haven't had that with privacy. We will have an Isaiah Berlin moment with privacy, and we'll tease apart the different aspects of the symmetrical, asymmetrical, different kinds of intimacy that actually underlie it. So I had various different kinds of privacy with a number of different kinds of actors, whether it's doctors, lawyers, my wife, my son, and they're all really quite different. Some are symmetrical, some are not. That hasn't happened yet, and I think that needs to happen before we can then ask lawyers to draft something.
Great set of answers there. How many more questions we've got stacked up? I knew there was one there, then I will take some on this side. Yes, Hadley.
I'm Hadley Beeman from the UK government and the W3C. I spend a lot of time thinking about government, where we all come together and agree certain behaviors and allocations of resources for the common good. And then on the flip side, the world of developers, where we build the tools that we need. So to make sense of privacy, how much is government regulation the answer? And how much should we build the web differently? Can we build the web differently?
Can we build the web differently?
Legislation is the answer.
Well, let me take John, then I'll...
So, as I've spent some time working on this, perhaps I can try and give you a succinct answer. One of the problems the web has is it has a whole bunch of unintended consequences attached to it. One of which was the ability to maintain state on top of what was originally a sort of fairly stateless protocol. And JavaScript was the sort of real evildoer. Of course, it's wonderful because it allows us to do all sorts of services, but the bad news is it also surveils you extraordinarily effectively. So the answer is yes, we can build a better technology which dissociates identity from data utility, and that's what I've been doing. The company called Privitar, P-R-I-V-I-T-A-R, in London, and one is
shameless advertising there, courses here, and the company there. That's fine. That's fine. But well done. Yes, Privitar, important.
Controlshift.co.uk. Just to, what else can I say? My telephone number. I don't know. Sorry, just on the legislative front. So, do you know? I think it's a balance, and Gavin's right. You know, it's getting all the stakeholders participating that's going to be critical. And one of my absolute fears is that we progress with a set of legislators and regulators that are basically looking through their rearview mirror at how to develop this for the future. You know, we have businesses that want to collaborate with legislators and regulators to try and project forward where this market's going to go, but we cannot possibly just say, right, okay, this is how it's worked in the past and that's how it's going to work in the future, because it's going to completely stultify our market. And I think, go back to the My Data program, one of the key things I thought was really important about that was bringing the consumer in so that they could start to participate, and then we can start working out where the big problems are in the market and start to understand where we're going to have the big car crashes and try to do something about it, rather than trying to predict where we're going to have the problems and creating legislation that will just stultify growth in our digital economy.
Just as we got the consumers in, the kind of government's attention wandered. But we'll have to try and fix that. Okay, yes.
Nigel, can I just add one thing, that as well as getting the consumers in, it's also getting the policymakers out to meet with the citizens, to have the conversation directly with what we want as a society. And I feel like I can't really overstress this point, is we have not yet started this conversation in the public domain. And I think it is such a fundamental question that we need to address as a society, that we need to have that conversation.
Yeah. Introduce yourself.
Christopher Brewster, Aston University. My basic question is, does the panel think that all this change in the private and public accessibility of data is affecting our ability to be creative and innovative. And I think this is a follow-on to Gavin's point about top-down solutions coming whether from government or from companies or from elsewhere, and your point about stultifying innovation.
Data and innovation. Yes? Anybody thoughts on that?
Well, I do, as you may have guessed. One great epiphany, another great epiphany I had when I was doing this work at Harvard, is that it isn't the individual harm that's the problem. Data leaking out about an individual creates a pain, they maybe get denied health insurance, this is a problem, but that isn't the thing that will move society on. In the same way that individual harm from smoking, where the benefit came first and the cost came future, that society doesn't change because of the impact on one individual. Sugar in food is the current problem. We know that sugar in food is not helping, but individual harm for one person isn't going to change society's view. It's the fact that we can't afford that across society that has changed our thinking about sugar in food, and in my father's generation changed our thinking about cigarettes. Now, privacy, we don't need to wait until we see that societal harm. We can see it coming. We know that society changes at the edges. We know it changes with those people who perhaps would change their behavior if they were being surveilled. That's what we have to stop. We have to stop raising a generation that might expect to be surveilled.
So I think this comes back to part of the theme around a digital public space and a grey economy. Would it be a utopian or dystopian vision if we fixed all of the copyright infringement online? Now, I'm a bit skeptical, to be honest, of the Copyright Hub, because I'm not sure which particular problem it's fixing. Because there's a very creative part of the web that completely disrespects all forms of copyright, and very willfully so. But when you look at that in a creative economy context, what is the additional value that is created? And if you started actually surveilling everything, and if you think about all of our media, whether it's radio, TV, or the press, you used to be able to read, listen to, or watch these things without somebody knowing that you were. And I think that's a really fundamental shift in our perception of how we are interacting with the kind of creative world around us. And the notion of increased surveillance, the notions of increased tracking, or the machine kind of AI-based rights assignment, and then sending you a bill, even if it's for 20 pence, for the usage of that particular photo in that slide presentation, completely changes the way that you relate to the society that you're in.
That's an old idea. And Liz?
I'm going to reveal my schizophrenic tendencies now and say that that actually legislation and regulation is needed to help clarify things, and that helps to innovate. So what we're finding is that because of the lack of clarity around legislation and regulation, businesses are almost burying personal data like it's some toxic waste, and yet there's huge amounts of value to be had for the individual in that information. And so businesses are struggling to understand where the line is, because the regulation and legislation is blurry. But they are still innovating, I have to say, and I think that's being driven, in my opinion, by consumer demand, because they're starting to see consumers demanding, needing, wanting new services that can utilize the data. So as they see consumers needing that in their ever-increasing, complex, rather busy lives, they are starting to look at developing new services which enable and use that data. So I think on one hand, we've got this need for a bit of clarity, which I think helps. On the other hand, I think it's going to get driven anyway because consumers are driving the need.
Thank you. That is 45 minutes. That's as much time as we should have had. We've had it. Thank you so much. I'm sorry there are questions to follow. Nail them at the coffee break, which will be truncated, and we will convene at 4-ish. Okay, thank you very much.